This is episode 368 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access insider history for every episode when you sign up to be a patron. Learn more at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Peter Wilson, author of Europe's Tragedy, A History of the 30 Years' War. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
So they normally carry such volume of water that they normally never freeze over. There's just so much water going through them that takes an awful lot for them to freeze over. And there's a lot of history of moments when other parts of Holland may have been completely froze under, but they were clear. And yet on this particular date, in February 1575, it's frozen over.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Since 1939, when Francios E. Matthas wrote it into scientific literature, the Little Ice Age has been known as a period of history between the 15th and 19th centuries when the climate was significantly colder than what's typical. The history generally divides the Little Ice Age into sections, which alternate between periods of warming to create wild weather phenomenon. This includes long frozen winters and cold, wet summers. According to the latest research from our guest this week, this Little Ice Age was delayed in England specifically, not taking hold there until much later in the first part of the 17th century. While continental Europeans encountered Little Ice Age conditions during the 16th century, the English population faced volatile seasonal variations with extremes of drought and severe storm weather, along with violent tidal surges. Our guest this week, Laurie Johnson, joins us to share some of the weather data he's compiling for his latest publication that looks at the impact of climate and weather on how we should understand the plays that were written right as these climate phenomenon were happening in England, as well as the playing companies staging these plays while these climate phenomenon were going on around them. Laurie Johnson is a professor of English and Cultural Studies at the University of Southern Queensland. He's a fellow of both the Society of Antiquaries of London and the Royal Historical Society, and an academic advisor on the Museum of Shakespeare in London. He is also a research dramaturg for the Oxford Marlowe Project, a project researcher for weather extremes in England's Little Ice Age, 1500 to 1700, and will shortly be taking up a visiting fellow role at the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities. Laurie's books include Leicester's Men and Their Plays, an early Elizabethan playing company and its legacy, and Shakespeare's Lost Playhouse, 11 Days at Newington Butts. Laurie's visited with us to talk about both of those books, and we have episodes that we'll link you to in the show notes for today's episode. Visit the show notes today to find out more about Laurie and even more of his publications. While you're listening to the show today, you can look at some of the in-depth history content related to the Little Ice Age and weather events in the 16th and 17th centuries. Things like primary documents, museum artifacts, period paintings, and more are all located in the detailed show notes for today's episode. You can find these at CassidyCash.com/episode 368. Log in on that page as a patron, and all of this bonus history will expand right there on the page, and you can look at it while you listen to the show. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Laurie. Welcome back to That Shakespeare Life. It's so nice to have you visit with us again and to tell us about these wild weather events from Shakespeare's lifetime.
Thank you, Cassidy. It's wonderful to be back on the show.
Let's start with what happened to poor shipmaster Francis Johnson in February of 1575. What does his letter to his friend Nathaniel reveal about his weather troubles that day?
So Johnson was an agent for this Nathaniel Bacon, a sort of prominent lawyer and landholder from Norfolk in the town of Stiffkey. He's known as Nathaniel Bacon of Stiffkey. We have sort of many of items of his correspondence and so on. What happens is it's relatively late in the winter, Johnson had been in Holland, in the Low Countries, as they called, making some deals and securing goods for Bacon's properties. He planned to be sailing back to Great Yarmouth. At the time, it was just known as Yarmouth. We've since called it Great, on the east coast of England. He planned to be out by this date to deliver these goods and papers back to Bacon, but instead, his boat was stuck. It was stuck fast in the frozen waters at the harbour at Dordrecht. Now, Johnson himself was stuck a further 30 miles away in a town called Brielle, with all the roads and waterways between Brielle and Dordrecht also frozen over. So his ship is stuck fast and he himself is stuck fast in another town. But he anticipates that it could be a long time before he gets to his boat and then that his boat gets out. So he decides to write this letter that we still have that survives, explaining to Bacon what's going on. And he sends that off with an available messenger that could next get out from further up around the coast at the town of Leyden. Now, the question is, what does this tell us about the Dutch Republic, of course? Dordrecht was a major trading port at the time. It was located on the confluence of three rivers, the Maas, the Merwede, and the Waal, where they drain into the North Sea in Holland's Dieppe near Rotterdam, modern-day Rotterdam. So they normally carry such volume of water that they normally never freeze over. There's just so much water going through them that it takes an awful lot for them to freeze over. And there's a lot of history of moments when other parts of Holland may have been completely froze under, but they were clear. And yet on this particular date, in February 1575, it's frozen over. It's not as if Johnson was a bad sailor. What it tells us about Johnson is that he's making decisions that he's already made many times in the past. He expects, even though it's still winter, technically, it should be clear. The water should be clear and he should be able to sail out. So this one's caught them a bit by surprise. It's not the first time it's frozen over. 1564, the big freeze that kind of covers a lot of Europe. Not that he was caught under, but certainly the harbour was also frozen over. But that at the time was considered to have been an event of such rarity that I think they all figured it would never happen again. And yet again, 1575, it all freezes over. And that then begins a kind of series of great freezes that follows up in subsequent decades that climate historians now recognise as what they call the Little Ice Age.
Being in a Dutch port less than 200 miles to the east of England, Laurie writes that Johnson's experience was very much within what one would expect for the time period and location. Laurie, what was happening in England at the same time this letter was written?
That's right. We now associate the golden age of the Dutch Republic with these vast frozen landscapes painted by the Dutch masters, because from the 1560s on, that regular freezing that I mentioned continued to happen, and that changed the way they did a lot of things. So we get used to this idea. A fellow by the name of Dagmar de Groot wrote a wonderful book on it about the great frozen age of the Dutch Republic, how that their requirement to adapt to all this freezing and the loss of their major ports for many years at a time led to changes in the way they administer things, the way they conducted trade and so on, leading to a significant cultural change. But what's really interesting is that in England, as you asked, until letters like Johnson's began arriving from the continent, people like Bacon were blissfully unaware of the Great Freeze going on over on the other side of the Channel. Now, I've dug deep into the archives looking for any sign of extreme cold conditions in England in February 1575, and there is nothing. There's just not a scrap to be found that suggests that there's anything remotely similar going on in England at the time. There was an earthquake on the 26th of February, felt through half the country, but not in London and not in Norfolk. Queen Elizabeth certainly had a full season of court revels in 1575 to suggest relatively mild winters in England, and she certainly planned her progress of 1575, the one that gives us the great entertainments at Kenilworth Castle, for example. That was in that year. So all of this planning was going on without any kind of sense of what was going on in Europe. The Privy Council certainly met as often as they should. In fact, one might even suggest a little more often, because there was a few things going on in the north that demanded their attention, and there was nothing to suggest they would have cause to give up their session. And of course, all the legal sessions throughout the country went on apace. There's nothing to suggest there's any kind of great freeze impacting northern Europe at that time. So I have to confess, when I came across this letter and then found no evidence of similar conditions in southeast England, I was astonished, because the climate histories covering the Little Ice Age have tended to assume that Britain's conditions were generally the same as those on the continent. It's part of how we formed this understanding of the Little Ice Age in the first place. There was clear indications from dendrochronological tests and ice core samples and so on to tell us that there were drops in temperatures at many points across the Northern Hemisphere. We don't have a lot of evidence from Great Britain, however. So what we have to rely on is other kinds of proxy evidence. We look for the letters, we look for the diaries and so on. And as far as I could tell, certainly in 1575, but for a great deal of the period that we classify as the Little Ice Age, there's just not a great deal of amount of evidence for that kind of great freeze in Britain. It certainly happens elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, but not in Britain until the 17th century. And I'm certainly happy to talk more about that in a moment.
To put that in a little bit of context for our U.S. listeners, that distance is not that great. I mean, it's not surprising that the climate historians would have assumed that the weather conditions were very similar, because the distance here is about the same as, like, between Alabama, where I am, and Georgia, our first neighboring state here in the U.S., that's a distance of about 300 miles. So it's just the distance between one state and the other. And we just did have a whole bunch of tornadoes come through here.
That's right. I flew through that.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, gosh, that's terrifying.
It was a bumpy ride, shall we say.
But we lumped everything together talking about these storms. And so when climate historians are saying, well, this is just 300 miles away, surely their weather wasn't that different. That's part of the reason why what you're finding is so surprising, is that they are really close. So it is surprising that they would be this different.
And one of the other issues related to that as well is that it's not just the distance, but that the body of water that passes between them, the channel, has the same current come through it. So the same current that affects the weather on land should be affecting land on both sides relatively evenly. And yet it's clearly creating a different set of conditions through some kind of confluence of events that I'd probably require the climate scientists to fully explain, but the evidence is there to tell us that that's what was happening. Yeah.
I was surprised to read that you were using the records of early modern playing companies to explore the history of this weather. How does information on traveling touring companies help inform us about the climate?
We've tended to think of playing companies for a long time in theatre history and the study of Shakespeare's era as having formed out of the wandering companies, the sort of the wandering players or travelling players, wandering minstrels, etc. And we have this idea that they started to settle in England in London, I should say, once conditions around London for playhouses to pop up became optimal, primarily Queen Elizabeth herself being very much into theatre and playing and wanting players at the court for the court revels and so on, becomes part of that conventional picture. What we're now discovering through playing company histories, Sally Beth McLean and Lawrence Manley and a bunch of others have sort of written books going through the histories of the various companies. And of course, on my recent list as Men One is another to add to that catalogue. We're beginning to realise that they clearly followed pre-planned routes. So when we know that they had an itinerary that they had mapped out in advance, we can then begin to look for trends in how often and when they followed those particular circuits, as we might use that term, and when they show signs of adjusting them. And then the question has to be asked, why would they have adjusted a pre-planned regular touring route? So I'd take the example then of Leicester's Men to say that I can certainly show that in their first few years of touring, 1559 to 1564, they routinely took a path from London up through the East Anglian side of the country, up to Norwich, and then went through what's modern Lincolnshire, through King's Lynn and up through Boston and so on to get into Yorkshire. But then in the middle of the 1560s, there is evidence of a great number of tidal surges and floods that affect the Lincolnshire lowlands. It used to be called Holland, in fact, the same name as what we get on the Low Countries in Europe. And this continual series of floods and surges leads to the destruction of many of the major road pathways and bridges through Lincolnshire, forcing a playing company, for example, to change the way it will go about touring. And in the first few years of this, we even get them just turning around and going back. So they create this shorter loop, East Anglian coast, back down through Cambridge and so on. And Yorkshire then becomes a different touring route up through the centre of the country. And so that's the sign that when you get something that's happening at a climatic level to affect the frequency and severity of floods, it can affect the playing company routes. And knowing the playing company routes helps us to map that impact. And at the moment, I'm currently working on the Earl of Pembroke's men's tour of 1593, which is conventionally seen as just being disastrous for various financial reasons. But one of the things I'm finding is evidence that they just also hit a run of really bad luck with weather, which may have affected their bottom line as well in terms of not having enough people come to the command performances to give them their more than their ordinary or more than was gathered.
If these weather events are having this sort of overall impact this way, could any of the weather events we see in Shakespeare's plays be reflective of real weather that was going on in England at the same time those plays were written?
Absolutely. We just need to be very careful that we don't reduce the work of the playwright, any playwright, let alone Shakespeare, of all people, to that of a recorder of events.
Sure.
It is something that happens when we're looking for proxy evidence. A lot of the work we do as historians or theatre historians is to look for cultural evidence, artistic creations. So one of the most popular ones when it comes to the Dutch art of the era is to look at their paintings of the skaters on the ices of the rivers and so on, or in some cases to even identify townships where a glacier will be added to the landscape in the background, and we get a sense that, okay, we know that's there. They're not making that up. It's not part of their mindset as a landscape painter at that time to fictionalize what they're painting. They're genuinely painting from observation. But at the same time, though, we need to be mindful when we do art history around that we're paying attention to the artistic interpretation of what they see through their techniques, their color palette, and so on. But at the end of the day, if there's a glacier in the painting, there was a glacier there in the real world. The theatre, of course, is not landscape art, but it still has a certain relationship to the reality of the time. We talk about topicality, reading Shakespeare's plays in relation to some of the events of the time. And if there was a confluence of weather patterns that might lead to concerns around famine, etc., then we might be looking for evidence of that in the real world as well.
We've heard about the Thames River freezing over, but Laurie's research writes about an opposing catastrophe of weather impacting the Thames when it was not too cold, but in fact, when it was unreasonably hot. Laurie, please tell us what happened to the Thames in the 1590s.
In fact, I was just going to say about the freezing of the Thames as well. There are some records, of course, of ice going down through the Thames and so on. Of course, we do get the freezing of the Thames as a phenomenon that happens from 1607 onwards. One of the things that strikes me when it comes to a play like, for example, The Winter's Tale, sad tales best for winter, etc. Well, that's true, but the longest scene in that play, one of the longest scenes I think in all of Shakespeare, is a scene celebrating the spring and the harvest and so on. It's a nature play more than it is a cold play, and it makes sense if you think about the probably one of the most famous lines in all of Shakespeare is not, of course, to be or not to be. It says, "Exit pursued by a bear." And of course, you wouldn't get that line if they assumed that a bear would still be hibernating during the winter. They certainly knew about hibernation as a bear phenomenon. But so then to think about the freezing of the Thames, however, as being something that goes from 1607 onwards, if we look back to the records prior to that, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that the Thames froze over often at all in the 16th century. So people have been keeping those records, and that involve people who lived at the time. We have to trust that they recorded it if it happened. We only get 3 records of total freezing of the Thames in the 16th century, and the last of them is the year in which Shakespeare is born, in 1564, the year of the Great Frost, the same one that had caused some severe frosting over in Amsterdam at the time, was also happening in London in that particular year. It's one of those years in which there is a confluence of weather patterns across the continent and in England. The other 2 years in the 16th century are 1515 and 1537. Now, for most of the century, though, things are very different. We get far more hot temperatures. We get far more violent storms following long periods of heat and drought. And this is true then of the 1590s, where some climate historians have assumed the 1590s were among the coldest of the decades, simply because the proxy evidence for that is that there are a series of years of crop failures, bad harvests of 1594 to 1597. Now, while there is definitely extreme cold in those years in Europe, the evidence for England appears to be something different. So you mentioned the first few years of the 1590s, they're being marked by several years of heat. And this is precisely what we get. There's this evidence of years of heat, followed then by suddenly the weather breaks and we get severe storms for several years running, such that the crops get obliterated. And I've written about that elsewhere. But if we look to those years of heat, the most extreme example, and the prompt for your question, I think, was that in 1592, the dry spell got so bad that the Thames actually dried up completely for 3 whole days. Thomas Short records that the river ran dry and horsemen were able to ride upon the dry ground to cross from bank to bank. And John Fox wrote, and I'll quote him here, "The Thames at London kept not his course, but all the water ran away for the space of 3 days, so that many things were found in the bottom which were lost long before." I can just imagine that the London residents, when they actually see the bottom of the river available to them and the ground dry enough that they can walk upon it, they go down and they find all this lost property that had been lost in the river in the years before that they've never been able to retrieve until now. Who needs a diving expedition when you just get all the water taken away?
Yeah,
Drain the oceans, as the TV show says.
In contrast with the drought-ridden Thames River, other records in Laurie's work point to excessive rainfall causing crop failures in England and even leading to tidal surges. Laurie, tell us about these periods of excessive rain. What records is it that give us this information? And how did local documentation of these events help you put together a bigger picture of the climate conditions?
Well, that's right. So there's the 2 periods of excessive rain that I've focused on my research to date, one of which, of course, I just mentioned. The other is in the 1560s, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, the period of tidal surges and inundation that led to change in the Leicester's men's pattern. It's important to think about how we know about these things, and hence your question, absolutely, it's the right one to ask. What are the records that tell us that this is the case? The historical record is actually pretty conclusive about the evidence for these protracted cycles of heavy rainfall and tidal surges, because England had an established government body at the time dedicated to the maintenance and monitoring of the waterways of England and the defences against flooding, the Commission of Sewers. Now, of course, when we use that word now, sewers, we tend to think of where, of course, human excrement gets flushed underground. But at the time, it was a term that meant generally any river or channel, any water channel. So because they didn't have big underground tunnels, all the sewers were any waterway that drained ultimately into the Thames or into the waterways around England. And so they could include rivers, creeks, channels, canals, drainage zones. By the Elizabethan era, the sewer commissions were so well organised, they sat in quarterly sessions 4 times a year, assessing potential flood risks and zones where water was being obstructed by rubbish or waste of any kind, and they kept detailed records, many of which survive. Those detailed records are ultimately government records, truthful documents about the nature of the waterways when they broke their banks, when they went dry, and so on. But in addition to this, what I'm finding is that the towns also recorded expenses for repairs for infrastructure from storms or flood damage. And the court calendar contains evidence of changes to royal progresses, for example, or Privy Council sessions, or even assizes, and other official events like musters and so on, where weather became an issue for them. So there's certainly lots of official documentation. And so then over the course of dozens of years, if you look at what the official documentation is saying about the weather in any given location, you start to get those patterns that become what climate historians are looking for, those long-term weather trends that form indications of a prevailing weather pattern or climate.
It's fascinating to me that it's not at all reliant on anecdotal evidence. I mean, we're talking about people's letters and diaries going into the research of this history, but you don't have to rely on people telling stories where you have that question of were they exaggerating or did they get the date right? On this one, you're looking at official government documentation where you can say, no, I know that this was going on this day. In your exploration of weather conditions, you've mentioned things like violent storms. Were these like hurricanes or a nor'easter, I think, for example? What kind of major violent storms were happening? And were these going on during Shakespeare's lifetime? Would he have experienced these?
Absolutely. There are, of course, examples that are sensationalized. Of course, we get the sort of broadside news pamphlets that are strange news from abroad style stories. For example, from 1577, we get a strange and terrible wonder wrought very late in the parish church of Bungay, a town of no great distance from the city of Norwich, namely the 4th of this August in ye year of ye Lord, 1577. I realise, of course, that should be pronounced the year, using the thorn. In a great tempest of violent rain, lightning and thunder, the like whereof hath been seldom before seen, is one of those sensational ones. But the value of such documents as historical records can be compromised by the capacity for exaggeration that they get. So even, for example, in that pamphlet whose title I just read, the most sensational component of that incident, not in the main title, but in the subtitle, is the appearance of an horrible shaped thing, a black dog, which other legends know as the Black Shuck, who is said to have appeared in the church during lightning strikes that lit up the view and then attacked residents, such that after the storm cleared, several of the residents hiding in that church were dead. Now, to what extent they died from a giant black dog attack, or it might have been some other event, we can't know for certain. And so as a result, we have to take such accounts with a grain of salt. But there are certainly many instances of fearful storms or weather anomalies that can be confirmed in the official records. One of my favourites, for example, is a massive lightning storm and possibly a meteor burning up in the atmosphere over London in 1574, in November. Here's the account by John Stode, who was around 50 years of age at the time. About midnight, several strange impressions of fire and smoke were seen in the air, coming out of a black cloud in the north toward the south till daylight. Next night, the heavens in all quarters seemed to be in a raging flame of fire, which rising around the horizon met in the middle, there doubled, and then rolled as in a furnace. On the 18th, at night, a hurricane came out of the south. So were there hurricanes? Absolutely, in 1574. And it seemed to be occasioned by, or at least in some way coincident with, a rather large meteor or comet in the sky that created great fear for everyone. Thomas Short has an account of the same event, and he attaches then its significance to a series of changes in the seasonal weather. He says the spring was like a summer, the summer like a spring, the whole harvest like a bad winter, and so on. And he refers to many exhalations, meteors, etc., seen in the air. But of course, the trouble is that many times people are reluctant to record these if it relates to their own personal experience, because there's very much a belief at the time that bad weather, and particularly severe bad weather, was a sign of divine vengeance, that God was angry at us. And so if you wrote about something that bad had happened as a record of it, that might actually come back to be seen negatively upon yourself. So many townships didn't keep those kinds of records. They would refer to the payments to repair things, but not explain why they needed a repair. And sometimes we have to put those two and two together.
So they were worried that if they wrote about it, people would think they caused it?
Absolutely.
I see.
We even get so one of the more positive ones in the English record is 1588. The Spanish Armada gets routed by a storm at sea. But that same weather pattern also affects things that were going on the mainland in England, including the Queen's address at Tilbury. She goes to Tilbury. First of all, she's advised not to because the ground is apparently potentially very wet because of all the wet weather. But she goes nevertheless, gives her great, I have the body of a king speech. But then on the way home, the conditions get so bad that she's waylaid at the village of Erith. But we only know about this because it's described secondhand in a letter by James Aske, a nearby resident, to relate that, by the way, did you know that the Queen stayed nearby overnight? There's no official Queen record or record within the Privy Council or documents of the Queen's carriage to indicate that happened. So we know about it secondhand. Even the Queen didn't want to say that this weather, which subsequently we know helped us rout the Spanish, clearly was divinely ordered. And yet you can't therefore give it a bad spin by saying it also kept me from getting back to London. So parts of the story change to create that impression. But I do have one other anecdote from 1588, which I think your listeners will be particularly interested in. And it's from the same weather pattern that routs the Spanish Armada, that holds the Queen up at the village of Erith. It affects Shakespeare's Stratford. We get a tidal surge coming through in 18th of July, 1588, up the Avon, that's so severe that the Stratford Bridge, Clopton Street Bridge, is broken in half. And there's this protracted description, but the only reason we know about it is not because the town of Stratford kept a record of it, but because nearby Welford-upon-Avon residents recorded in very detailed fashion some of the damage that was done to Stratford as a result of this flood. And the bridge is broken down, and it's so severe that we get the account constantly talking about how the water was 1.5 yards more than had ever been recorded. They even refer to some old fellow, Old Father Porter, who'd been buried 4 years before this, who was 109 years of age at the time of his burial. I got to admit, I only just realized that that's saying a guy lived to 109 years of age, by the way. That's phenomenal.
That's what I was thinking too. I was like, oh my gosh. And
it says from his memory, he had never known the water to be above the level of his bed. And yet they say that in this particular flood, it was 1.5 yards above that mark. So it's the biggest flood Stratford's ever known. And it comes from the same weather pattern that struck down the Spanish Armada. It also strikes down Stratford, but the Stratford locals don't write about it. And of course, what does then happen is we get the playing companies who had been travelling to Stratford fairly regularly in the years up to that point. They suddenly stop coming. Not so much, I think, because of the fear of retribution from God, just that the bridge is out. Their passage in through the town from that northeastern side is taken away. So instead, when they're in Coventry, they go around the other way.
So what records do we have about these weather conditions impacting the traveling theater industry at this time? You've mentioned a couple times that we know they rerouted, but what are we looking at that tells us this?
And that's it. The point is there are no records to actually say that they've changed their mind or not done this particular route. We have to do it by process of elimination and knowing what the patterns are before and then what the patterns are after, and look for those signs of shift. So the records themselves, of course, they're not there because the playing companies don't keep records of that nature. And of course, they are also a profession that's looked upon as lewd and common and even godless. So if they were to describe that their patterns of travel were affected by God's wrath, that would just prove the point of the anti-theatricalists. So they really don't want to go around saying this sort of thing. So instead, my focus is on trying to find the evidence for those shifts, what changes around the time there might seem to have been evidence that the weather was probably a factor, without it being ever explicitly said that it was a factor in affecting the decision. I asked the question in the Leicester's Men book without ever actually saying that it's clear proof, that it just so happens that at the same time the playing company, Leicester's Men, can't do their regular tour up through Lincolnshire, that's the time that the Red Lion gets built, 1567. And while there is some belief by some people still, because it's a very prevailing understanding of the Red Lion Playhouse, was that it was only of a very temporary structure. Certainly the excavations that are happening in Whitechapel and have been for a couple of years now under Steve White's team, the Southeast London archaeology team, there's plenty of evidence that it was a permanent structure, at least semi-permanent structure, that then, even after it ceased being a playhouse, was converted into other kinds of uses. The building was there and it was meant to be there for a very long time. So there's something to suggest that at that time, if you're going to put up a permanent building for playing, something caused you to do that. Was weather a factor? It's at least coincident. Whether it's a deciding factor, that's for the debates to be had.
From tidal surges to droughts, earthquakes, and more climate phenomena, there's a mountain of exciting research to unpack from Laurie's publication on weather records and playing companies in this early modern period. I will link you to more on Laurie and his work in the show notes so you can explore that publication and follow the research he's continuing. Laurie, we are excited to learn more about weather from Shakespeare's lifetime. In addition to your publications, what are some resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
So the first resource I'd recommend, although still in development, is the ArcGIS database developed by Madeline Bassnett of Western Ontario. And in fact, it's received a Digital Innovation Prize from the Renaissance Society of America, will be awarded at the conference in the coming days. And it's extreme weather in England's Little Ice Age, 1500 to 1700. We're in the process of populating that with as much data as we can possibly gather from those 200 years. Another good general list of major weather events is at the Weather Web. Simply by following the link that Cassidy has provided, you'll be able to pick the relevant century, and there's plenty of detailed weather events documented in the century from 1500 to 1599, and again for the following. And an excellent general introduction to the history of weather, forecasting, and climate modelling is at the Science Museum online. And of course, there's a link to my latest article, which is published only just in the last couple of weeks in Early Modern Studies Journal.
These are fascinating resources. We will place links to all of these in the show notes for today's episode, so stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Laurie, as you know, because you've visited with us before, this is the part where you get to choose one book you would like to take with you on a deserted island. My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those. You've chosen some before, so you can redo, I suppose, or you can have a brand new selection. It's up to you.
That's it. I honestly can't remember my answers from my previous appearances in the show, so I do apologize if this answer finds me repeating myself. It's very likely that I would have said something by Douglas Adams in previous, because, of course, I adore the man's work and he is sorely missed. So to change things up for this appearance, though, I'm going to go for a book that continues to bring me at times to fits of laughter, The Far Side Compendium by Gary Larson, cartoonist. It's just a book of my favorite cartoons of all time, including my very favorite one of a small single-celled thing holding a lasso above his head and saying, "Adios, amoebas."
I think that is a fabulous choice for your deserted island. Absolutely. Well, so what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, believe it or not, first of all, I'm still working on the climate stuff. This has been going on for several years now and it's going to keep on coming. And of course, there's a book that we're working on, the we being myself and Elizabeth Tavares. That's still to come under that. We have the kind of working title of Playing Conditions. I've also got a collaboration underway with a specialist in weird fiction, Anne-Marie Wicks, for a short title called Weird Shakespeare. I don't know if I can say the potential publish yet because it's still under consideration, but I'm hoping to have good news on that in the near future. And that is a book that explores some of the ways that Macbeth and the Weird Sisters in particular distort language norms and the conventional modes of storytelling in a way that undermine what we've become so familiar about that story with. What we'd say is that plays right out there on the edge of convention, pushing past what we call a kind of weird threshold. And there's a raft of other projects. So I've recently been granted a visiting fellowship with the Southampton Institute of Arts and Humanities, thanks to Dr. Callan Davies there. I'll be working with archaeologists and theatre historians on the study of the Guildhall, the Bargate. And just quietly, I'm drawn to the idea of a book on Guildhalls. It might be where I go next. I'm toying with that idea. I think Guildhall performance is an understated component of early modern playing and the evolution of Shakespearean playing. We tend to focus on the big theatres, but not the Guildhalls in which so many of the travelling performances would have been undertaken. So that's probably something to look forward to if I convince myself to go that way.
Always one to have multiple fascinating projects going. I don't know how you do it all, Laurie, but I was certainly glad that you do because we love getting to hear about the history that you uncover. Congratulations on the award at the RSA. And we thank you for taking time out of your time in Boston this week to meet with us and share about this exciting work into weather history and how that lines up with Shakespeare and life in the late 16th and early 17th century. As ever, it has been a pleasure speaking with you and getting to learn more about this history.
Thank you, Cassidy.
As promised, all the information that Laurie has talked with you today is packed into the show notes. You can find links to his work along with the resources he recommends for you. And be sure to check out the detailed show notes for this week, where if you want to see the visuals that go along with some of the climate events we were talking about today, they're all packed into the detailed show notes. All of these things are available on the show notes page for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 368. That's CassidyCash.com/EP 368. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.